All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our November Community Forum. We are excited that you all can join us today as we are closing our semester for the year. This will be our last Community Forum for 2020, and then we will pick back right up in January. The community forums are brought to you by William James's College Council for Inclusive Excellence. This is a council that has members from our staff, from our faculty, from our students, from our alums, and our trustees who join in community to think about how we can move our institution and our college to be more inclusively excellent and all the strategies in which we do that. And one way in which we build community is planning to come together at the last Wednesday of every month to learn and to gather and to share knowledge and community. If it was pre-COVID, we would be doing this with food in probably one of the three rooms. But what's the wonderful thing that Zoom has allowed us to have is our global community present. With that said, we have a fantastic speaker today, Tre'Andre Valentine, and to introduce them, I would like Meredith, our Assistant Dean of Students, to invite them to our space today. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. Tre'Andre Valentine currently serves as the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition. Tre'Andre is a queer, transgender, Carib Indian, South Asian, and Black individual from the Caribbean island of Trinidad and Tobago. After graduating from Emmanuel College in Boston with a degree in psychology, Tre'Andre focused on anti-violence work in LGBTQ+ communities. They have over 10 years of experience in supporting LGBTQ+ survivors of domestic violence, grassroots organizing, community engagement, fundraising, training, facilitation, educational programming and development, specializing in anti-oppression and LGBTQ+ inclusion. I would now like to turn the program over to the wonderful, fantastic, amazing Tre'Andre Valentine.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you all today. I'm very excited about this. Just something to note is that there's currently construction happening on my street, so I actually can't control how loud they are out there, but hopefully it won't be too disruptive. But I'm really excited to be here and to share a little bit more about trans and non-binary identities with you, and to also share some history, some stories, as well as a bit of a landscape of where we are now in terms of trans rights. So like Meredith introduced me, my name is Tre'Andre Valentine. My pronouns are both he and they. So I invite folks, to switch it up. I'll just get on started. Share my screen here. So I've got a couple of slides. Well, not a couple, but a few slides, and hopefully we'll have time for some discussion. This is I tried to condense this as much as possible, but in order to have this conversation, I think that we need to have the foundation of the basics that we're talking about. Okay. So let's get this started. Okay. So just a little bit about the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition, or MTPC. As the acronym, we're dedicated to ending oppression and discrimination on the basis of gender identity and gender expression. And today we will be just covering a little bit about going over some terms and definitions about identities, really talking a bit more about pronouns, sharing a bit about trans and non-binary experiences. I'm going to show a couple of videos, and then talk about allyship and what that could look like. So really, in terms of understanding identities, we need to start thinking about what is gender, right? And one of the first things that, in terms of gender, we need to talk about the difference between sex and gender. And so what's the first thing that people ask when they know that someone is having a baby? They ask, what are you having? Is it a boy or a girl, right? And that's really about sex. And sex is really the assignment at birth of male, female, or intersex, and that's solely based on the physical anatomy of genitalia. And what intersex means is it's just a general term used for a variety of conditions in which a person is born with reproductive and sexual anatomy that doesn't seem to fit the textbook definitions of male or female. But sex is more than just the physical anatomy of genitalia. It's about chromosomes. It's about hormonal profiles, internal sex organs, external sex organs, as well as secondary sex characteristics that come with puberty. So then what is gender? Because the two get really conflated together. Gender is really just a social construct that characterizes the way we behave, how we dress, the way we express ourselves, the way we groom, the roles that we play, the performances that we may do, and the actions as basically within this binary of masculine and feminine. And when I say the binary, what I really mean is that it's also a social construct that situates the assignment of sex to the assignment of gender. So that someone who is born male, they are assigned the gender of boy or man. And someone who is female is assigned gender as girl or woman. And this really dictates the way people who are assigned to these categories should act, should behave, should dress. And we know that gender is not it's not based on biology. It really isn't. That even though we are assigned a gender at birth, that this is nothing, has really nothing to do with biology, that it's really a social construct. And this construct, this gender binary, really limits and excludes trans people, non-binary people, intersex people, and people who are gender expansive. It also is very restrictive for people who are cisgender, right? Folks who are not trans or who are not non-binary or intersex or gender expansive. I think we've, in some way, shape, or form, can have experienced the actual oppressiveness of some of this gender binary, where you feel like you have to fit into a certain box or be a certain way just because of the gender that you identify with. And so what is gender identity? Really, it's just simple as a person's internal self of what their own gender is. And then we've got gender expression, and that's really how a person outwardly exhibits their gender, and that's typically through clothing, hairstyle, makeup, behavior, or mannerisms, etc. And something to note is that someone's gender expression may not always line up with their gender identity. And that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be for safety reasons. It could be for a lack of resources. It could be that, that's something that they choose to do that day. So it's not something that is always going to align or that you see align with someone's gender identity. So like I said, a person's gender identity may not align with their sex assigned at birth, nor does their gender expression or presentation may always match their gender identity. And also not all transgender people identify within the gender binary. Not everyone is trying to transition from one gender to another. Also, pronouns are associated with gender, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And the big thing is to not make assumptions, but to ask. So before we go a little bit deeper into gender and gender identity, something to note is that sexuality is something that also gets conflated with gender. Some people think that people who are lesbian or gay are also trans, and that's not true. that sexuality, when we think about it, most of the times, the first thing that pops into our mind is about sexual orientation. But sexuality is a lot more dynamic than that. Yes, there's orientation, which means that it's someone who you're attracted to physically, emotionally, sexually. For some people, it's cosmically, but there's also behavior, what you do physically, whether it's sexual contact, whether it's dating, and then there's identity, what you call yourself, the labels you use to describe yourself. That's a self-identification. I really like this graphic. It's the sexuality galaxy. It really shows that sexuality is quite dynamic, and it is pretty vast and expansive. So trans people and non-binary people, intersex people, just like cisgender people, can identify their sexual orientation as gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, queer, straight, all of the labels and in between. So that it is really that everyone has both a gender and a sexuality. Those two things are very different. I heard someone once say that sexuality is who I go to bed with, and gender is who I go to bed as. So it's just something to note that's a distinction there. Okay, so now I want to show this video just to cover the basics about it's a Trans 101 basics. And what I like about it is that everyone in the video identifies under the umbrella of trans. Okay, so let's see if yes. No. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing, and now I have to switch out my screen. Okay, give me 1 second. Just navigating this a little bit. Oops. Aha, here we go. Can everybody see this YouTube video?
We can.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to start playing.
Say it one more time. No, 5, no, 3. Sorry. 3, 2, 1.
When we think of the word gender, a whole lot of images rush to mind.
Most of us are taught the idea
that people are born a boy or a girl.
And we're expected to act a certain way based on what's between our legs. But that actually isn't true for everyone.
It totally ignores the huge and amazing world of people who are trans and gender diverse.
And that's what we're going to dive into in this series.
Being trans, gender identity, and what it's all about.
Welcome to Trans 101.
Traditionally, we tend to think of gender as decided by the body we're born in.
People are usually assigned female or male at birth.
But bodies and gender are actually pretty separate things.
Gender is basically part of someone's internal sense of self.
It can be male, female, neither, a mix of both, or exist totally outside of that.
A person's relationship with their gender can also change over time as well.
The gender we're assigned at birth usually gets reinforced by the people around us over our lives.
Hearing things like, be a man, or you're such a girl.
It can feel like we're being told who we're supposed to be.
Most people feel comfortable with the gender that they're assigned.
But for some people, that label never quite fits and doesn't feel right.
That's what's called being
Transgender.
You've probably heard the term transgender or even gender diverse.
That's when your gender doesn't entirely match the one you're assigned at birth.
A lot of people use trans for short.
That can mean the gender you were assigned felt meaningless, restrictive, or altogether just didn't quite fit.
That might seem like a pretty broad definition, and that's because it is.
And the most important thing you need to know,
There's no one right way to be trans.
There are a lot of different ways people might identify.
It's not about knowing every single one,
but rather being open to difference when you encounter it.
And also keep in mind that gender and sexuality are largely separate things.
Lesbian, bisexual, asexual, gay, and straight are a few different examples.
But we're all those things in addition to being trans.
They're not the reason we're trans.
I think for me, there's kind of been this expectation that I transitioned because I like guys and wanted to get with them more easily. Actually, I'm a super gay lesbian.
When we talk about gender identity, people often think of two opposing groups.
A binary of female and male, and that when you're trans, you go from one to the other, but there's a lot more to it than that.
Putting it simply, non-binary is an umbrella term people use
to describe gender that doesn't fit squarely into male or female.
And this can include people who feel that their gender is a mix of both.
Changes often,
or is something totally separate,
or have no strong sense of gender at all.
Different people might use more specific terms to describe their gender, whilst others use non-binary.
And trans people who aren't non-binary,
who identify as strictly male or female,
might describe themselves as binary.
There's also a term for people who aren't trans, that's cisgender.
Cisgender is a way of saying not trans.
You might also have heard it shortened as cis.
Being cisgender is when the gender you identify as totally matches the one you were assigned at birth.
The term comes from Latin, meaning on the same side as.
And is used in contrast with trans, which means on the other side of.
It might be a new word to get used to, but it helps avoid a contrast of trans people and normal people.
And instead, just recognize that being trans or cis are just different ways to be.
So if you're cisgender, this is a great word to add to your vocabulary.
Transitioning is when someone takes steps
to socially or physically feel more aligned with their gender identity.
First is social transitioning.
Social transitioning involves how we interact with people.
Such as coming out as transgender.
To ask people to use different words and pronouns to describe us.
Or changing the way we interact with gendered spaces like the bathroom we use.
Physically transitioning often involves a person altering their appearance.
To what feels right for them.
Like clothes, makeup and hair.
Or seeking medical support.
Which can involve hormones or surgery. Transitioning isn't about appealing to other people.
Or necessarily trying to look like a cisgender person.
It's about a trans person doing what feels right for them.
And what that means for each person is different.
It's also important to know that transitioning isn't instant.
There's a tendency to think of transitioning as something automatic, like there's a fairy godmother who will pop up and magically change everything. Transitioning is a gradual thing.
And everyone's different.
No two people transition the same way.
A trans person's identity isn't defined by the way they do or do not transition.
So if someone doesn't feel transitioning is for them, that's totally cool too.
Gender dysphoria is an intense discomfort a trans person may feel
about physical attributes or the way that they're gendered by others.
Gender dysphoria can be on a social level, a physical level, or even a purely emotional level.
Dysphoria can be really overwhelming sometimes.
Having to live with a body or expression you're not comfortable with can really impact the way you're living.
Trans people find different ways to alleviate dysphoria.
And the positive impact that can have is enormous.
Like transitioning, having dysphoria doesn't make someone more or less trans.
And it's not something all trans people experience.
There will be a lot of new words.
We often hear things like, that's grammatically incorrect.
Is that a real word?
Fine, you got us.
We couldn't get any store-bought brand name words.
So we have to go with garden grown, that twice as nutritious.
In reality, all language evolves at a community level.
Every single word.
For trans people, we're developing language that describes who we are.
Because in the past, either a lot of the words haven't existed,
or those that have been created by people outside the trans community.
And don't always reflect our experiences.
When you're talking about gender and bodies, talk about what you actually mean.
People will have uteruses instead of women when talking about bodies.
Because some trans guys and non-binary people have those too. Or if you're talking about being a woman, avoid things like people with vaginas and just say women, because not all women have those.
There's also never a need to say he/she when talking about a group of people.
They will do just fine.
It's shorter, less clunky, and more inclusive.
Using the right language makes trans people feel included, and it's actually more accurate as well.
Learning this stuff so you can be more informed is a pretty awesome thing to do.
So if you found this video helpful,
Share it online so you can reach even more people.
And if you want to know more, check out the rest of Trans 101.
Full of even more awesome videos about gender diversity.
Okay. So I really like that video because it really sort of breaks it down on a very digestible level. Let me make sure that I'm sharing my screen again. Okay. All right. Okay. So just to do a little bit of recap, thinking about transitioning specifically, that it's really just a person's own personal process of beginning to identify and live as the gender they know themselves to be. And this can include, but not always, changing name, changing gender presentations, changing pronouns, and for some folks, medical transition. Now, we heard the term non-binary, and that's really an umbrella term for a person who identifies with or expresses a gender identity that's neither entirely male or entirely female. It's somewhere in between, it's both, it's neither. And under that term, there are many different words that people use for themselves. Okay, let's see here. I'm just, for the purposes of time, going to go past this slide. And I will actually, in the chat, I'll put a link in there so that you can watch it yourself. But this is really about non-binary people explaining what non-binary means for them. And it's a really, really good video. But just like sexuality, gender identity, and gender is actually pretty vast, right? It is quite dynamic. And it's not just, again, about sex assigned at birth and how that relates to the gender that people are assigned. It's quite vast. And also, you see, there are many different words that people use to describe their gender. So now let's go on to pronouns. One of the things that I get asked often is, what is a pronoun? And I'm like, well, let's go back to, my English class growing up in Trinidad and Tobago, my primary school. That really, pronouns is really just a word that replaces a noun in a sentence. And it's used to avoid repeating the same nouns over and over again, right? Like a person's name. Common pronouns, these are common pronouns that are used. And the thing to note is that you never want to use it for a person. That's used for an inanimate object. And there are many different types of pronouns that each serve a different purpose. When it comes to personal pronouns or gender pronouns, those are used as a substitute for a person's name. So you wouldn't say, like, oh, I met Tre'Andre on this day and Tre'Andre did this presentation and Tre'Andre is going to hopefully come back to the school. You use either, well, my pronouns are they or them and he and his. So we use those pronouns. So how would you know what gender pronouns someone uses? It's never by, the assumption should never be by the way that someone looks, because you can't actually tell by the way someone looks what gender pronoun that they use. Or you can't assume by the person's voice, right? There's oftentimes I get ma'amed on the phone and have to correct people and say I'm not a ma'am. And I have a neighbor upstairs who is not trans. She's a cisgender woman. And her voice is very, very deep. And she gets sirred a lot. And she often has to correct people. So it's never by the way someone looks and it's never by the way someone sounds. It's by asking them, simply. And how do I ask? Pretty simple. What pronouns do you use? When introducing yourself, I often introduce myself as, hello, my name is Tre'Andre, and I use he and they pronouns. And then you ask the person, what pronouns do you use? It's as simple as that. So why is it important to use the correct pronouns? Again, you can't know what someone's pronouns are by looking at them. And really, it's just one of the most basic ways to show that you respect someone's gender identity. And for someone who doesn't have to worry about what pronoun someone is going to use based on how they perceive your gender, that's really a privilege. And privilege in and of itself is never a bad thing. Just to put that out there, it's really what you do with it. So this chart is, it's not an extensive chart, but this is just to show you all the different pronouns that people can use for themselves. He, she, they, ze, I, per, or someone's name. And this is not for you to now like, okay, I need to learn these pronouns right now, right away, but it's just to show you that there are many different pronouns in the world. Now, we're human beings, we're gonna make mistakes. And one of the things is to really not make a big deal when you've made a mistake, sort of just acknowledge it and move on. And I really like this graphic. Says, so I was hanging out with James the other day and he said, and then the person just interjects and says, they said, right, thanks. Guess what they said to me? And just keep the conversation moving. So a little bit more about trans and non-binary experiences, and to sort of frame the issue right now, I'm going to share some stats with you, and this is from the National Center for Trans Equality. Now, they do this national survey every 5 years. So I think because of the pandemic and everything that's going on, that the 2020 survey has been delayed. So these are stats from 2015. So keep in mind that this is pre-COVID stats, right? And also the stats are also higher for someone who is either, okay, I'll just start and then continue on. So trans people face triple the rate of unemployment, pardon me. And this is even higher if the person is a person of color, if they live in a rural area, if they are a trans woman, if they are disabled, right? 1 in 3 trans people have had 1 or more negative experiences in a healthcare setting. And that could be verbal assault, physical and sexual assault, being denied care, having to educate the healthcare provider. And then 40% report attempting suicide at some point in their life, which is 22 times the rate of the general population. And that's pretty high. Nationally, 23% of trans people report experiencing housing discrimination. And currently, there is only 16% of trans people who own a home compared to 63% of the population. Now that we know that number is probably higher now, sort of during the pandemic. 1 in 5 trans people experience homelessness, and out of 1 in 5 trans people who experience homelessness, the number is higher if the person is youth. And also we see that is probably about 60% of the LGBT people who are homeless, about 60% of that are trans youth. So that's a really high number. And then 70% report coping with mistreatment through drug or alcohol use. 1 in 4 trans people delay medical treatment of any kind. It doesn't have to be related to their gender. It's of any kind for fear of discrimination. And 68% of trans people do not have IDs or legal documents that reflect their identity or common use name. 90% of trans adults report experiencing discomfort in their workplace because of comments or bias against trans people. So again, these stats are really alarming, but something to note is that not all trans people are living horribly depressing lives or have these traumatic experiences. that there are trans people in the world who are thriving, who are living their most beautiful, authentic selves. But just to note that these are definitely, these are stats that are just real. Okay, so what does media representation have to do with anything? Media representation plays a huge part in shaping culture. And within our culture, I don't know if anyone has seen the Netflix special called Disclosure, but that actually explores how media representation has shaped the views of people in regards to trans and non-binary people. And a lot of the times, the media represents trans people as sex workers, whether we're just doing it for attention, and also represent trans people as serial killers or people who are deceiving people in order to harm or kill them. And that's just not true. But this really does shape the way people actually view our communities. So we are right now in Trans Awareness Week, and this has been inspired by Trans Day of Remembrance, which has been really about acknowledging the trans people who have been killed due to transphobia. And of the documented murders of trans people annually, it's usually always trans women of color who have been the majority of victims. And in some years, they've been the victim of every documented murder. In 2019, 22 out of 23 reported murders of trans people in the United States have been Black transgender women, and 81% were under the age of 80. Right now, the statistics for the life expectancy of a trans woman is 35. And that is really, really alarming. In 2020, actually, I needed to change this stat because I just found out that another trans woman was killed by her partner. But so it's 50 transgender people that we know of so far in the US have died, 35 by the acts of violence, 7 by suicide, 3 from the coronavirus, and 1 from medical complications from gender-affirming procedures. 4 other cases are unknown, and that's due to lack of information. And the reason why I say that we know of is because a lot of times trans people are misgendered in reports, and so that we don't always know the gender identity that someone is trans based on some of the reports that we get, because again, the media often misrepresents trans people. So in terms of allyship, what can you do? Some tips that we've come up with is thinking about when you're asking questions or when you're talking to someone who is trans, think about whether this is something that you need to know versus if this is something that you want to know. Also, not making assumptions about anyone's gender identity and not outing trans and non-binary people to others because you may not know where and who they are out to. Always address people by their common use name versus their legal name. And think about also too, when you're sending mail home to someone, thinking about whether, again, who they're out to, because some folks are, they may be out at school, but they may not be out at home. And also using your voice for the greater good, right? Speaking up when there are transphobic remarks, or where you hear, people are discriminating against others, trying to be a buffer for that, especially if you are a cis person and a person who has privilege. And ask about pronouns and correct misused pronouns. Note again, consider and clarify where people are out and to whom. And just some general problematic terms to avoid. You never want to call someone a tranny or it or he, she, or ask about, have you had this surgery? Refer to someone as pre-operational or post-operational. saying that someone has had a sex change or referring to someone as a transvestite. We really want to avoid saying a woman that wants to be a man or a man in a dress, or talking to someone or referring to someone as a trans or transgendered. You know, when you add ed, basically that you have basically put transgender is now a verb and not a noun. You know, no one is lesbian or gayed or straightened, right? Or bisexual. So the person is transgender or trans. And avoid using preferred name and preferred pronoun. Say use common use name or the pronouns that you use, because preferred sends the message that there is your real name and your real pronoun versus the one you prefer to go by. And then questions like, what was your name before? Questions about surgery. When did you feel like a man or a woman? These aren't necessarily appropriate questions to ask. So this graphic I would like to share that I'm sharing shows you a map in 2019, so last year, of where all anti-trans bills have been put forth throughout the US. And just something to notice that 2019, we saw the highest number of anti-trans bills with 136 being filed in the US. And now this is a view of where there's been anti-trans bills with regards to student athletes. So people are really, you know, these are adults who are pretty much coming after young children, young people. So our youth are absolutely at risk. Not something to notice that even though there's been 136 bills that have filed, not all of them have been passed. So that a lot of work has been done to actually block some of these bills, and that has been successful in most cases. So when thinking about how you want to create an inclusive environment, well, actually before that, well, I'll continue then and sort of circle back to what's happening on more so the local level. So in creating an inclusive and welcoming environment, one of the things to keep in mind is you want to really do an assessment of where you are versus where you would like to be or where you think you should be. Making sure that you are educated, you know, making sure that you collaborate with identity organizations like MTPC, taking a look at the policies and protocols and practices that you have in place. Are these inclusive of trans people? Are these inclusive of gender identity and gender expression? Some of the services that you may be offering or provide. Taking a look at your physical environment. Very often, people, I mean, we gravitate to things that when we see ourselves reflected. So in our physical environment, if you have posters up, are those reflective of the different kinds of people that you are working with, that you are interacting with, or that you are serving? And then thinking about the ways in which you communicate and do outreach. And also doing reflections once you've sort of gone through a process of really examining and maybe instituting change within the college, thinking about reflecting and having a format for feedback so you know exactly how you're doing, and then do a reevaluation and possibly again an assessment. So this is, I think, a very circular process, because you don't just stop there, or you don't just stop with one training. It's ongoing work. So some recommendations I have, and this is not something that is like these are some things that you have to do, but these are just recommendations. One is including pronouns in all introductions. Some people may not be comfortable with that, and that's okay. Edit your email signature. For me, I use he, him, his, and they, them, theirs. And again, this is a recommendation, not a requirement, because not everyone feels comfortable with their, particularly some trans people, if they're not out, with their pronouns being in their email signature. Examine and replace unnecessary gendered language. Think about, using language like client or customer or student or professor, child, sibling, parent, friend, colleague, person that we're working with. There are so many ways to use non-gendered language. And mistakes happen. We are all going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes, and that's okay. Just apologize genuinely and move on. And when in doubt, default to gender neutral pronouns like they, them, theirs. Now, they, them, theirs have, a lot of people have been like, well, isn't that grammatically incorrect isn't that a plural term? Well, actually, it is grammatically correct to use they, them, theirs as to refer to a singular person. And we've been doing so since the 13th century. So yes, it's grammatically correct. And even if it weren't, so what, right? The point is to make sure that we are making ourselves open to other people's experiences, respecting them, and mirroring the language that people use for themselves. I want to end on this video because what I like about this video is that it really, it talks about different, not everybody thinks that children know themselves, right? Children are still developing. How do they know their gender? And this video actually shows that that myth is not true, even though people are still developing, that children, do know themselves. And it's a really great video. I like it a lot. And let's see here, new share. Okay, wait, let me just line it up real quick. And then we will end on that, and I'll share a little bit more about what's going on currently with trans rights on the state level. Okay.
Is it hard to be trans now?
Sometimes. On the news, it says like people are hurting transgender people, especially transgender African Americans, and that makes me scared sometimes.
My hair, I would always try to keep it somewhat long. I was visiting my dad. He said, we're shaving it off. As I'm like crying, he pretty much had to hold me down to shave off all of my hair.
One of the first things that I did after I started putting the pieces together and realizing I was a boy was I kept praying and kept asking for guidance. But the pastors at that church were not using my pronouns. They said that they were not going to support me, so we had to leave.
Some people don't know who they are until like a long time. I'm someone who knew who I was quickly. I told Mom that I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. She said, okay, you feel like a boy. And I said, I don't feel like a boy, I am a boy.
I think I spent a year being scared, a year crying. I don't think you guys saw me cry, but I would cry at night. I felt really guilty. I thought maybe I hadn't raised a proud girl. My mom kept saying, if you just put a dress on her. I tried that. I tried to convince Penelope that she was a girl.
I mean, growing up was Republican, Catholic. I remember being really scared. People are mean. Will they hurt you? Will they hurt us?
I love my dad, but he essentially said, that's wrong. You have a mental disease. You need to be fixed. To be quite honest, it was pretty much hell to be living as myself at home and to go to school and be somebody else.
God is the most important thing in my life. I had a lot of tough conversations with God about what's happened here. Where did I go wrong?
I don't think we could have raised you in an environment that was less conducive to making you think that you were transgender.
My dysphoria got worse. I just hated the constant use of the wrong pronouns and having to pretend that I was a girl.
Reese was really withdrawn, kind of seemed depressed. When you told us this, I think it was kind of like, oh, okay, well, if this is what's going on, great. Let's figure out how we can help you to live life as a boy so that you will be the joyful person that you are.
I'll never forget that first time that you performed as Nicole, when you stepped onto that stage in that dress with a microphone and sang. It was without question a defining moment because I had never seen you in such an authentic way.
The more we watched Penelope year after year after year, now 10 years, we realized Penelope is a boy. He's not faking it. He's not pretending. He's not playing dress up. He is a boy.
Do you guys have any memories when you were growing up of him doing anything that you felt didn't really seem like a girl would do?
Yes. Yes, 100%.
The coach was screaming at me, run after the ball, and I would start skipping, like doing some weird thing that was exactly what they told me not to do, that was girl stereotypical.
Reese came up to me and he asked, so how do you be a boy? I started to think about it and then I said, well, gotta use power tools and everything.
You gave me some of your clothes.
I let him use my clothes. I don't know if you knew that.
You were imitating your brother from very early on. So if Cassius would stub his toe, you would say, my toe hurt, mama. And if Cassius would get in trouble, you would take a timeout.
First thing we did was get your hair cut. So he got a really short...
I got a boy haircut and then boy clothes.
And boy clothes.
He looked like a different person, And I could tell that he was more happy in that image.
It's the first time I allowed you to wear a dress and
female clothing in public. I feel like a bird that's been trapped in a cage since the day she was born, and for the first time got to spread her wings and fly.
Well, I definitely liked that I was wearing clothes that helped me to pass, but at the same time, I knew that I wanted to dress like more androgynous, but I wasn't sure if I would get the courage to do that. But I think once I started dressing this way, I realized that this is more me.
How did you feel about my medical transition?
I couldn't understand the whole blocker concept, but as puberty got closer, as theater and singing became so important, the thought of your voice changing, you not being able to be a soprano and perform became really, really clear to me.
I remember when puberty was coming, I was like, no, we need to get in there like now, get this done because I don't want to go through anything.
A lot of my friends were so excited for all the changes. And I was like, why on earth do you want a womanly body? Like, that makes no sense.
I think your exact words were, I'm going through the wrong puberty.
I've always been the same person. My hair changed, clothing, and that's it.
I think you're the same person. I think what shifted was as I saw you so much more confident and happy, that encouraged me to try to be a better mom for you.
I was so happy to have another brother and everything. And it was a really special day for me to bond with Reese as a brother and considering him that way.
I feel really safe in our community. But if I think about the news, I think, wow, if we just went to a different neighborhood or different state or different country or a different part of the world, maybe we wouldn't be as safe.
With Reese living his truth helped us to see the truth in everyone else as well. And some people aren't prepared or understand this journey.
Our church didn't support Reese, so we're trying to search for a new church that includes and loves and cares for everybody.
Do you miss your dad?
Yes, and my half siblings and my stepmom, like I miss them, but that love came with conditions.
When you initially came out, I was very afraid of the reaction of friends and family. And now I don't really care about that. What I'm most fearful for now is your ability to see your self-worth and how much your love's valued.
When I thought my child is something that no one talks about, that no one knows, that I don't have any example of, I was really scared. But the more scared I felt, the more I put my energy into changing people's minds.
It absolutely fills me to tell our story, meet with legislators, and help other families.
I think it's our job as a family to come alongside Reese and be a light for people and to say that this is who God made. God made Reese, and it's a special gift to us and a special gift to the world.
I like to let people know that we are a family of transgender people and cisgender people. If people don't like who we are, then they can go someplace else.
I want to make a change and make the world a better place for everyone, so people can just be themselves and don't have to worry about the world around them judging them. They can just be.
Okay. So I really like ending on that video. That video always, like, I always tear up whenever I see that video. Such a moving, powerful piece.